This is sort of a weird kludge between not quite a Dharma talk and not quite a facilitated discussion, but sort of a, today we're starting our annual precept study. And I'm here today to start us off, to sort of launch the process and to talk about the precepts in general. And what the heck, I'll go ahead and say the opening verse. May the sacred presence of the one who said he would abide in his teachings be our guide. May we follow his glorious example and tread with unfaltering steps this noble path until we too shall attain enlightenment. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Maha Prajna Paramita. I always feel like that's a good restart. So once again, good evening. For our evening service today, or tonight, we recited the Kyoju Kaimon, the 16 Bodhisattva precepts. And we'll be reciting that throughout the entire time of our precept study this winter. Usually we change up our liturgy every month, but with the precept study, we just keep with the Kyoju Kaimon recitation during our precept study. And we're doing that at Dharma Rain as well. I think Dharma Rain started their precept study last week, and we recite Kyoju Kaimon for morning service in the mornings, with the exception of Sunday morning, and Wednesday evenings as well. So it's being recited a lot right now. This is something that we do every year, and something that we come back to again and again. So this precept study, this business of taking the precepts, of reorienting towards precepts or recommitting to precepts, this is about us. This is about us in our lives and our practice, each of us. And precept study is an intimate examination of how we conduct our lives. We can think of these precepts as koans in a way. They're not strictly definitive, and they're not defined in a way that satisfies a mind that orients towards linear, rational, straightforward. And each person may interpret them in a different way depending on their circumstances, depending on where they are in their practice. And this doesn't mean that these precepts are relative, but instead it means that we each have a challenge to lean into that is our own. These 16 Bodhisattva precepts are given to us as examples of enlightened activity, or examples of ways bodhisattvas function in the world. They're presented as guidelines for wholesome action. And we read them again and again and again and again together, reciting them together as a way not only to read them and think about them, but also to get them into the body. When we do a recitation like this over and over, it goes in a different way than just if we were reading them in a book. The ears engage, the mouth engages, the eyes engage. If we were all in a room together and reciting together, then there would be a way in which we all harmonize together, maybe not necessarily in pitch or tone, but in pacing. That We would follow the pacing of the precenter who follows the pacing in the chant book. And we give up our ideas of how fast we should go or how slow we should go and orient towards moving together as one. So our precepts, these 16 Bodhisattva precepts, they're not things that the Buddha would have said. He didn't utter the 16 Bodhisattva precepts. They weren't written down in Pali. They come to us through the Mahayana traditions, loosely-ish pulled from the Brahmanet Sutra. There's many, many more precepts in the Brahmanet Sutra. But these first sets, the set of 16, have been in our tradition for centuries. And of course, they've come to us through translation, and different centers will translate them differently. So if you're reading Robert Aitken, or if you're reading Daido Loori, or if you're reading Thich Nhat Hanh, then all of these precepts are they're going to sound a little bit different. They might use different words. They might emphasize different aspects. And that's okay. And in a way, it's good to read different translations because it gives a sense of like, what is this actually getting at? What is this precept actually trying to move me towards? So when we give the precepts in our tradition, in this Dharma cloud tradition, we give the precepts freely. Usually, if people want to take the precepts formally, in a very ceremonial way, oftentimes, people come, they do precept study, they talk to the teachers, they step forward and say, hey, yes, this is something I want to do. There's a big ceremony. They publicly declare that they want to live their lives with the precepts as guidance. They receive a wagesa, which is that little black strip of cloth that symbolizes a lay Buddhist in our tradition. And we consider those who have taken the precepts, or taken Jukai, as we call it, to be a Buddhist of the 10 quarters, meaning taking the precepts is not necessarily making a commitment to a teacher or to a lineage or to a temple, but it's just making a commitment to try to live ethically by these guidelines. So we give them freely, and yet they are important. They're not to be taken lightly or carelessly. Dogen, in a fascicle called Jukai in the Shobogenzo, says, to assume the form of the Buddha, to come into possession of the Buddha's precepts, to get what the Buddha received and used, these are not small matters. So our precepts form the basis of our functional understanding of ethics and moral decision-making. They reflect an inner purity that manifests in outward behavior. And they're not a system of morality imposed from outside. And they've changed a little bit over time, adapting to the needs of the culture. So how they're held, how they're presented, how they're talked about, is really reflected by the community that's doing that holding. These precepts can be held as koans, as something to contemplate, something to lean into, something that's not necessarily straightforward. So don't rest in a current understanding of, oh, this means that. Go deeper. And these precepts are not commandments. They guide and they shape our lives to the degree with which we invite them to. Willingness is important. Try them on. Experiment. What is it to hold a different perspective about what a precept might mean. So I mentioned a little bit ago this business of taking the precepts. What does it mean to take the precepts? You know, in a way, it is that aspect of coming forward and stating that you want to live your life with their guidance. And naming it that way, it feels very externally oriented. But for those who have taken the precepts, often there's a very visceral, felt sense of what it means for that person, what it means to me, what it means personally. And my hope is, as we go through our precept study and our series on the precepts, that people will talk about this. As we do this series on the precepts, we'll have different Sangha members presenting a precept or facilitating a discussion on the precept. And we'll probably be doing 2 each week, which is going to make for tight discussions, but it brings different voices into this conversation. And it allows us as a community to talk about this. What comes up? What is this about? What does this mean to me? What does this mean for us? What does this mean for us as a Sangha? How do we understand these things? We take the precepts at Jakai, which is that ceremony of like publicly stating, this is what I want to do, to live my life by the precepts. We take the precepts again if people commit to becoming a lay disciple, which means formally taking a teacher and making a commitment to the lineage. We take the precepts again at the monastic ordination, and precepts are taken again at a funeral. And, you know, in all of these, in the first 3 ceremonies, when the precepts are recited, everybody in the room says, I'll do this. The phrasing is, you know, a precept will be read, and the phrasing is, from this present human state to that of becoming Buddha, will you keep this precept or not? And everybody in the room says, I will. So even if you've taken the precepts before and you're witnessing a ceremony, you have the opportunity to again affirm that for yourself. At a funeral, it's different. At a funeral, the precepts are recited and someone stands in for the deceased, usually a close friend or a close relative. And when these precepts are recited, from this present human state to that of becoming Buddha, will you keep this precept or not? The stand-in for the deceased says, I will, on behalf of the deceased. But nobody else in the room does. And if you have a body memory, at least for me, having that body memory of having a whole room take the precepts, it's so striking to hear that one single voice at a funeral. We often talk about taking the precepts as sort of the Buddhist conversion ceremony. You know, this is where we publicly say, I'm going to live my life as a Buddhist. And the part that references or gives life to that is this element of taking refuge. I just skipped over a whole bunch of spaces in my notes. I'll talk about taking refuge and then we'll come back to the stuff I jumped over. So there's this element of taking refuge. And it's in part of what we read in the Kyoji Kaiman. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. In the earliest times, in the Buddha's times, really this was all that was done for ordinations, was for someone to come and say, you know, I'm sure they had a conversation with the Buddha, but to take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. I've seen refuge ceremonies in the Tibetan traditions, and they're very different than our Jukai ceremonies. But there's still that core element of taking refuge that is so is so powerful to witness, and it's such a joyous thing to witness. Um, and it's something that, I encourage people to think about if they were doing this for the first time. Like, there is that aspect of taking refuge, and what does that mean to a person? What does that mean to you when we think about this? It's one thing to recite it as part of the Sangha, it's another thing to say it in the midst of the ceremony of Jukai. We talk about giving and receiving the teaching of the precepts. I think that's the way the Kyojukai starts out, giving and receiving the teaching of the precepts. And this aspect of giving and receiving, every time we utter the precepts, we're giving and receiving. We can think of it at times as the teacher gives the precepts to this new person who's becoming a Buddhist. We can also think about it as the Buddhas give the precepts to all of us. Or an aspect of giver, receiver, and gift being empty comes into play here. Who's doing the giving and who's doing the receiving? What is being given and what is being received? In a way, nothing is being given. It's just an awakening to our own self. Awakening to the mind that wants to live in accord with the Dharma and move in harmony with what is felt as most true. Part of our practice as we do this, I mentioned the recitation of the Kyojukai. There's also a recollection practice that that we do in the evenings, or at least I was taught to do this in the evening, where the details of the day are drawn through the mind. You can either start with the beginning, waking up in the morning, or you can start with what is most recent, whichever way your mind works. Some people like to go forward, some people like to go backwards. But you draw the elements of the day through your mind and just recall what happened and who you spoke with. And notice if there's any clenching or tightening, perhaps in the chest or in the face, elements of contraction. And often this sort of physical response to remembering the elements of the day denotes a place where perhaps some of these precepts were being infringed upon, or perhaps there was some unskillful action that looking at that through the lens of the precepts might be helpful and for preventing such things from arising again, or just noticing habit patterns around body, speech, and mind. This can be fruitful practice. So, perhaps I went to work in the morning and, everything was pretty neutral. I checked my email at work and I checked the patient census and I noticed some excitement about who I was going to go see and curiosity about who I was going to meet. And, I get in the elevator and there's two people having an argument and I can feel myself tense up. Untangling that, there might be tension around my own responses to conflict. What is my role? Some confusion about should I intervene or not? Then I can go through and look at some of these precepts. There's no real precept that says, well, when you're witnessing a conflict, you should do X, Y, and Z. They're not set up that way. But perhaps I can sort of nod my head around the precept of not indulging anger, which I didn't feel angry, but there's that question of contriving a reality for the self. What is this reality around role or identity? That might come up. That might be something useful to look at. anyway, it just becomes an exercise in which to engage more with the precepts and to really start looking at our lives through the lens of the precepts. And I can say that word, precepts, 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 so much that I start to lose sense of what it is I'm talking about. So I'm very glad that we have so many people who are going to be presenting these precepts over these next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks after this. I'm just going to talk about that schedule really fast, if that's okay with you all, and just say who's doing what. Next week, we'll have Monica talking about contrition and Dixie about the 3 pure precepts. On January 26th, Dixie will have do not kill, and Jyoshin will have do not steal. On February 2nd, we've got Shokai with do not misuse sexuality, and Emily with do not speak dishonestly. February 16th, Penny will bring us do not become intoxicated, and Choan will bring do not dwell on past mistakes. The week after that, Shokai will have do not praise self or blame others, and Kemio will have do not be mean with Dharma Ola. Then Peter will have do not indulge anger, and Teiko will have do not defame 3 treasures. And then I've got the very last one to sort of wrap up and summarize the whole series. If there are those who haven't taken the precepts and are interested in taking the precepts, please speak to me. We have a day set aside for a Jukai ceremony in March, I think. And, you know, we've done this in the past. We've set aside a day for a Jukai ceremony, and some years we have people who want to take the precepts, and so we have a ceremony that day. And other years, we don't have people who wish to take the precepts, and, you know, then we don't have a ceremony, and it's fine. It's all well and good. So I think that's what I have to say about sort of orienting us to what we're going to be doing, what we're going to be talking about. If there are questions, I'm happy to answer them, or in the absence of questions, I would love to hear from you all about how you feel about starting precept study. What are you looking forward to? What are you worried is going to be a big drag? Which I don't think anybody will have that, but I just wanted to give people the option just in case.
Is a question about how to handle them okay now, or should we wait till the end?
How to handle what?
When you read the precepts every morning, it kind of gets old. Do you have any tips? Is that a good question?
Sure. You mean reciting them again and again and again? There's an element of, yeah, watch out for that mind that decides it's being bored, and lean into that curiosity. And oh, go ahead.
I meant, yeah, you're right, but the mind that starts just not even seeing the words, it's just become too old to refresh it. Is there?
I would say when you stop seeing the words, put down the page and start reciting from memory. You'll engage it in a very different way. Yep. It becomes very intimate that way. Trish?
I like the precepts every year because I kind of forget about them and, you know, don't really focus on them as much as I really do like to, because I benefit from them. So every year I look forward to kind of being refreshed and refocused. And so I think I said the same thing last year, but it's really true. It kind of grounds me. And I like what you just said as advice to Dixie, because I think that's right on, because I have them on my phone. I think Joanne told me that. So I used to go out every morning, and when I walk my dogs, I would sit down and I would go through them on the phone, and it was nice because it was I read them, so I'm hearing my own voice repeat them.
Mhm.
But I think trying to just say them from memory, maybe one at a time, and just then less than a minute thinking about what that means to me right now. So that was really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited about it. I love this time of year.
Yay. We also, this is not related to what you were just saying, Trish. It's a little bit of a non sequitur. But we also recite the precepts when we do our Fusatsu ceremony. We will recite the Kyojukaimon and then sit for half an hour. And then in the ceremony, each person has an opportunity to speak to something that's going well in their practice and something that's a challenge in their practice. And so we recite the precepts ahead of Zazen as a way to reground. I think that's what the part of what you're saying, Trish, that made me think of this, that opportunity to reground in the precepts and once again look at our life and what's going on with us through the lens of the precepts. John?
I think one thing that comes up for me every year is what differently comes up every year. I think the piece of precepts that's always, it feels new to me almost every year, just because a different precept comes, rises for me every year. So I think that's what always kind of just re-energizes at this time, because I seem to work with something different.
Yeah. Life is not static. The self is not static. Things continue to change, and we're challenged by different things in different times. This ongoing pandemic continues to be problematic, and climate change continues to happen in different ways, and other social stressors are popping up, and as the self tries to respond and cope, different things might show up in terms of precepts that might be important. I know a lot of people who are getting fatigued and tired and just frustrated and at the end of their rope, and different precepts might come up in response to those. My little joke about maybe this is becoming a drag touches on that, like, do not defame the three treasures. So we notice things. Nani?
I really enjoy studying the precepts every year. I didn't always enjoy it because coming from a Catholic background, I sort of originally saw them as like commandments, But over the years, I've kind of realized that it's more, for me, it's more like a roadmap to life, I guess. And so I just really appreciate them, and I'm super grateful for them, because I really need that roadmap sometimes. I can't necessarily trust myself, my gut, or my emotions to tell me what the right thing to do is, or so yeah, so I really enjoy this time. I always get something interesting from it.
It's very sweet to hear. Thank you for sharing it. It's a nice affirmation of how they can be a benefit. And I appreciate you saying that you didn't like them at the beginning and something changed. You became accustomed to them, found value in them. something to celebrate.
I like what you said earlier as how they are, and you didn't say quite this way, but as a guide for skillful behavior,
Mm,
outline the pattern. I find that probably the best part.
mhm.
Yeah, I guess a good word that I like to use is a framework. Like I use a lot of frameworks in my life just for a lot of different things. And this
Mhm.
is kind of like the ultimate framework, I guess. It's just super helpful to have it. Like, and it feels very, yeah, like it's just very, it's like a gentle sort of prod in the right direction, I guess you could say. You know what I mean? I'm probably starting to sound stupid now, so I'll stop. I'll stop talking. Anyway, I just really appreciate them, and I'm glad that they're just a part of my practice. So
Yay.
You know what else comes to mind for me is that they feel new to me every year. Like one thing that I think about when I'm training, every time there's new staff, I have to repeat a training. And if the other staff has let their their certification expire, they have to redo the training. And many times there's the same people in that training. And I go in there and I look around the room and I see these people that have heard the same training, sometimes 3 or 4 times. And I think some of these people in this room could give this training. They've been in here so much, and it's the same training. Nothing ever, my stories, reflections when things have come up, they're all the same. And that's not the case with precepts. It comes up every year. And even though the actual verbiage is the same, they're very fluid. They change even just personally every year what they mean to me. It's different. Something new pops out. It's different for me than it may be for Monty. She can get something totally different out of that precept than I will. So that's what jumps out for me, is that it's just, even though we do this every year, it's never the same. I don't hear the same. I don't see the same in the same precept. Even if I repeat a precept, if the same precept is speaking to me that maybe spoke to me 3 years ago, it's very different than it was 3 years ago.
Mhm. In a way that keeps these living teachings, living guidances, that they're not stagnant. Yes, the text is the same, but the benefit we get from them is very much alive, very much a part of our life.
That made me think of something that would be cool. I don't know if I or we would take the time, but John, what you just said about how every year the same things mean something totally different. It'd be cool to summarize either after each session or at the end of the precepts, kind of individually, like what they meant for us, and then look back year after year. I think that'd be a really fascinating sort of history of how we individually grow, and maybe even as a community, as a Sangha. That would be fun.
Mhm.
Very informative. I might try and do that.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Good idea. Yeah. Other questions or comments? We've got about 7 minutes left.
Well, Jyoshin, I wanted to third, or maybe it's fourth, what you said about memorizing the Kyoji Kaimen, and how you do engage it in such a different way, that way.
Mhm.
And I think that's true with a lot of the texts that we read.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just very different, and I liked
Mhm.
actually that you didn't say a lot more than that about it, because it is kind of a non-verbal way of engaging them when and it's also interesting to me because I do them from memory to notice which ones I forget,
Mhm.
that'll jump out at me, like I guess
Mhm.
I don't want to think about that one today, or um, and the whole Kyoji Kaiman is so lovely. Not just the precepts, but
Yeah.
yeah, the whole thing is so beautiful, and so many of the lines of it are moving, like those they who release their suffering and embrace all beings. Such a moving phrase.
There's a part of it that I haven't ever done this with patients out loud, but there's part of it that I'll use as prayer in the hospital.
Mhm.
May the Buddhas and ancestors have compassion upon us, help us through the obstacle of suffering we have inherited from the limitless past, and lead us in such a way that we share the merit that fills the universe. For they in the past were as we are now, and we will be as they in the future. And in the Kyoji Kaimon, it goes into the contrition verse, but I usually just stop there and just let that be a prayer of remembrance and reflection, and grounding in that sense that we're inheriting this Dharma, and how we embody it matters.
Another little practice that I'd like to do because of my contrarian nature, I think, is to imagine situations where it would be more skillful to break each of the precepts. It's the thing that I think is interesting, and I never feel badly about that, because the precepts aren't telling you you're going to, everlasting flames when you break one. It's saying you will break them. You can't keep them. It's not possible. As Mani said, she used the word gentle, and I like that. Yeah. I mean, I first thought of them as a description of, when I first read the precepts, I thought of them as a description of how happy people behave. So it wasn't like, in that it wasn't like, this is what you should do, these are rules you have to follow or you'll go to hell. But it was just like, well, more like the 12 steps, really. Like, this is what we've noticed. We wrote down some things that happy people seem to do, and these are them. And it wasn't until later that I heard them described as the description of enlightened activity, which is a little bit different, but not completely different.
Mm-hmm.
I really value the plain descriptions. I have trouble with things like when you were saying arouse curiosity. Those have become just phrases to me, but practices I can actually do are very valuable.
Good to know. I'll remember that. Yeah. And it's interesting to compare the translations. The way we have them phrased has both the sort of the prohibitory side and then the skillful side. And I appreciate that balance of not just don't do this, but here's the thing to do, here's the thing to lean into and experiment with.
Would you just remind me one more time where there are two phrases under each precept? What the first and the second, I mean, would you just say something about those two?
The first one is considered to be attributed to Bodhidharma. The second one is considered to be attributed to Dogen. And Bodhidharma's phrases are usually coming from the view of the absolute. Dogans are coming a little more from the relative, but in his Dogen-like phrasing, it's not always easy to tease out a linear description. So the first one is considered to be from Bodhidharma, and the second one is from Dogen.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't remember. what
Yep.
that was.
Yeah. And so they're sort of elaborating on the precepts from this view from the absolute. Big mind.
Say that again. They're coming from the what?
The view from the absolute, from big mind, or this bodhisattva mind.
They both are. Are you saying one is and
I would say the first more than the second, but
Okay.
in their own way.
okay, thank you.
Dogans are a little more practical. One minute left, last call. Invitations from anybody who hasn't said anything yet. All right.
I like when I'm the variety of ways when I can read the precepts to myself before sitting, when I choose to do that. Plus, when it's part of the program for the day, to hear other people's familiar voices reading it, because it's almost like a call and response where I hear someone reading that and I think, oh, my body knows that phrase. And so, you know, I'm just here quiet, sitting. But so I like both. And I like the simplicity, in a way, directness of the statement, and then the depth of the openness, the challenge of the precept. Thank you for this.
Thank you for that, Ruth Ann. You spoke to that beautiful aspect of Sangha interaction as we recite these and hold these together. I liked that description of almost a call and response. It feels different when we're all able to hear each other's voices at the same time. It can be very supportive to hear your voice surrounded by all of the voices of the Sangha. But this way is good too. Thank you. Alrighty, please make that show.
I just wanted to say one thing. You know, when I alternate between listening to the recitation and then reciting it with the person. Now that we're on Zoom, you know, I don't always read it along, but you know, it's interesting the difference between listening and reciting it.
Yeah, it is. It is a different experience. I'm glad you're doing what works for you.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Abiding in this ephemeral world, like a lotus in muddy water, the mind is pure and goes beyond. Thus we bow to Buddha. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, maha prajna paramita. Thank you all. I'm looking forward to hearing from Monica and Dixie next week. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Nice to see you, John.
nice to see everyone.
Yeah, it is. See you in the morning, Penny.
Yep, bye-bye.